We all like to think that our homes are our sanctuaries and that the wilderness is a place of peace. But tonight, these 3 stories will prove that safety is often just an illusion. I've curated 3 true scary stories that will make you double-check your locks and question every shadow in the corner of your room. So dim the lights, put your headphones on, and stay tuned, because you're about to find out why you should never ignore that feeling of being watched. I used to believe that the city was my fortress. The constant hum of the traffic, the neon lights bleeding through my curtains, the sheer number of people surrounding me. It felt like a shield against the dark. But last October, that shield didn't just crack, it shattered. My name is Sarah, and I spent 5 years working as a freelance architect. If you know anything about that world, you know it's a meat grinder. I was buried under blueprints, deadlines, and endless client emails. I reached a point where I couldn't even look at a computer screen without my chest tightening. I was burnt out, truly, dangerously exhausted. My doctor called it environmental stress. He told me I needed to disconnect, not just a weekend off, but a total unplug from the world. I found a listing online for a place called the Blackwood Haven. It was a small, isolated cabin tucked away in the deepest part of the Adirondacks, miles from the nearest paved road. The photos showed a cozy wooden structure surrounded by ancient, towering pines. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions. I remember the feeling of relief when I clicked book. I thought I was going to find peace in that silence. I thought the woods would heal me. I packed my bags, grabbed my favorite books, and left the city behind with a smile on my face. I didn't know I was walking into a trap. I didn't know that the silence I was so desperately seeking would eventually be filled with the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in a room that was no longer empty. The journey took nearly 7 hours. As I drove further north, the lush green scenery of the suburbs began to fade, replaced by the jagged gray mountains of the Adirondacks. The road transitioned from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement and finally to a narrow gravel path that seemed to lead nowhere. The GPS lost signal about an hour before I arrived. I remember looking down at my phone and seeing "no service" flashing in the corner. Usually that would have made me nervous, but that day I felt a strange sense of victory. I was finally beyond the reach of the world. I pulled into the clearing just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The cabin was beautiful, built from heavy cedar logs that looked almost black in the twilight. But as I stepped out of the car, the silence hit me like a physical weight. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a park, it was heavy. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just a cold, stagnant air that felt like it had been trapped in that valley for 100 years. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the front door. The key turned with a loud metallic click that echoed through the trees. Inside, the air was even colder. I flicked the light switch, but only a few dim yellow bulbs flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden floor. The cabin had a smell, sharp like copper and dust. I spent the first few hours unpacking and lighting the fireplace. I thought the fire would make the place feel warm, but the shadows in the corners seemed to pull away from the light, huddled together as if they were hiding something. I made a pot of tea and sat by the large window in the bedroom, staring out into the pitch-black woods. That was the first time I felt it. The feeling that I wasn't just alone in the middle of nowhere. It was the feeling of 1,000 eyes hidden behind the trees, all focused on that single glowing window. I closed the curtains, but the feeling didn't go away. The first night was restless. Every time the cabin groaned under the wind, I found myself sitting bolt upright in bed, straining to hear something that didn't belong. The next morning, the storm had cleared, but the air inside remained frigid. I decided to explore the house more thoroughly, trying to shake off the paranoia that had taken root the night before. That's when I found the basement door. It was tucked away in a dark corner of the kitchen, partially hidden by a heavy oak cabinet. It wasn't like the other doors in the house. This one was reinforced with metal plating, and there were 3 heavy-duty deadbolts installed on the outside. On the outside, as if the goal wasn't to keep someone from getting in, but to keep something from getting out. I remember running my fingers over the wood near the floor. It was shredded. Deep, jagged gouges were carved at the base of the door, as if someone or something had been desperately clawing at it for years. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. I told myself it was just a previous owner with a large dog, but the scratches were too high, too precise. I backed away from the door and tried to focus on my work, but the cabin felt different now, smaller, more crowded. Later that afternoon, while looking for a spare blanket in the living room closet, I found it. A small, leather-bound journal covered in a thick layer of gray dust. It belonged to a girl named Emily. Based on the dates, she had stayed here 3 years ago. The early entries were like mine, excited, peaceful, but as I flipped the pages, the handwriting became erratic, frantic. She wrote about the man in the spaces. She wrote that he didn't use doors, that he moved between the walls, watching through gaps in the wood that shouldn't exist. The last entry was just one sentence, scrawled so hard the pen had nearly ripped the paper. He knows I can see his reflection now. I dropped the book as if it had burned me. I looked at the window, then at the mirror above the fireplace. Suddenly, the silence wasn't quiet anymore. It was a roar in my ears. I realized then that I wasn't just being watched from the woods. The woods were already inside the house. Night fell quickly on the second day, bringing with it a storm far more violent than the first. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the cabin, a relentless assault of water and wind that seemed determined to break through the logs. I didn't want to go to sleep. I kept the lights on in the living room, sitting on the sofa with the fire poker resting across my lap. Around 2 a.m., the power flickered, once, twice, and then total darkness. The only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace, casting a weak orange glow that barely reached the walls. The silence that followed the power outage was deafening, and then I heard it. The rhythmic breathing. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the hallway leading to my bedroom. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like lead. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I walked slowly toward the bedroom, my breath hitching in my throat. I stepped into the room and turned the light toward the large window. The rain was washing over the glass in thick, distorted sheets, and then a flash of lightning split the sky, turning the world outside into a stark, white photograph. In that split second, I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the backyard, about 20 yards away. He wore a dark, tattered hoodie, and even from that distance I could see his eyes. They didn't look like human eyes. They caught the light of the lightning and reflected it back like a predator in the tall grass. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it was painful. Another flash of lightning, he was 10 yards closer. Another flash, he was at the edge of the porch. I scrambled back, reaching for my phone, my mind screaming for me to run, but where could I go? I watched, paralyzed, as he slowly raised his hand toward the glass. His fingers were gray, impossibly long, and they moved with slow, deliberate grace that made my skin crawl. He pressed his palm against the pane. I didn't wait to see his face. I ran. I ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air as I dialed 911. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the rain and the faint, rhythmic scratching on the other side of the wall. The flashing blue and red lights felt like a dream. I didn't realize I was screaming until the officer had to put his hands on my shoulders to steady me. "He's right there! He's at the bedroom window!" I pointed with a shaking hand, my voice cracking from the cold and the terror. Two officers moved toward the back of the cabin, their heavy-duty flashlights cutting wide paths through the rain. I stood by the front door, shivering, clutching a blanket one of them had given me. I waited for the sound of a struggle. I waited for them to shout, "Get on the ground!" But all I heard was the steady drum of the rain. After 10 minutes, the older officer walked back toward me. He looked confused. "Ma'am," he said, wiping water from his brow, "we searched the entire perimeter. There is no one out there." I shook my head violently. "No, I saw him. He was right against the glass. He put his hand on it." The officer sighed, his face weary. "The mud around this house is 6 inches deep from the rain. If anyone had been standing there, their footprints would look like craters. But the mud, it's perfectly smooth." My heart stopped. "That's impossible," I whispered. I led them into the bedroom. I pointed to the large window. "Look, there, the handprint!" The officer shone his light on the glass. There it was, a large, greasy, distorted palm print right in the center of the pane. He stepped onto the porch outside to wipe it away. I watched him through the glass. He rubbed the spot with his glove, but the print didn't move. The officer's face went bone white. He stepped back inside, his boots thumping on the wood. He walked over to the window, took a deep breath, and ran his bare thumb across the inside of the glass. The handprint smeared. The man I saw, he hadn't been standing in the rain. He had been standing in the dark corner of my bedroom, directly behind me, the entire time. What I saw in the glass wasn't someone outside, it was his reflection from inside the room. The officers found the basement bolts had been unscrewed from the inside. Henderson, the owner, never answered my calls. I moved back to the city the next day. I live on the 42nd floor now, surrounded by steel and concrete. But every time it rains, I don't look out at the storm. I look at the reflection in the glass, making sure that I'm still the only one in the room. Stay safe, and always check behind your doors. Have you ever felt like your own home was rejecting you? Like you were an intruder in a space you paid for? I moved into my new apartment last month. It was a dream on paper. Top floor, hardwood floors, and a view of the city that made the rent feel like a steal. But from the very first night, I knew something was off. It was the corner of my bedroom. Just a simple corner where 2 walls met, but the shadows there, they didn't behave the way they should. Even with the hallway lights on, that corner stayed pitch black, solid, dense. I remember lying in bed that first night, staring at it. I saw a silhouette. It looked like a tall man standing perfectly still with his head tilted slightly to the side, just watching me. "It's just the shadow of the wardrobe," I told myself. I actually said it out loud just to hear a human voice in the silence. But then, I saw it move. Not a fast movement, it was a slow, deliberate lean, like it was trying to get a better look at my face. I fumbled for the lamp and flicked it on. Click! Nothing. The corner was empty. No wardrobe, no coat rack, just blank white drywall. I laughed, but my breath was shaky. I thought it was just exhaustion from the move. But as I reached over to turn off the light, I felt a sudden, sharp chill right against the back of my neck. And in the silence of the room, I heard a faint, raspy exhale. It wasn't coming from me. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I just sat there, with every light in the apartment blazing, watching that empty corner until the sun came up. By the next afternoon, I felt like an idiot. It was just a night terror, I told myself, stress from the move. But deep down, I knew that exhale was real. I decided I needed proof. I needed to see what was happening when I wasn't looking. I set up my old DSLR camera on a tripod, aiming it directly at the corner. "Let's see who you are," I whispered as I hit the record button. Night 2. I left a small nightlight on in the hallway, just enough to give the camera a grainy black and white view of the room. I fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep around 2 a.m. At 4:12 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound that made my heart stop. Crack! The sound of plastic snapping. I sat up and saw my camera lying on the floor, its tripod legs shattered as if something heavy had stepped on it. Hands shaking, I grabbed the SD card and ran to my laptop. I scrubbed through the footage, my breath hitching in my chest. For 2 hours, the screen showed nothing but a static, dark room. But at 3:49 a.m., the shadow in the corner began to unfold. It didn't just stand there. It peeled itself off the wall like a layer of dead skin. It was thin, unbelievably thin, with limbs that were far too long for any human. The last thing the camera caught was a pale, fingerless hand reaching out from the darkness and covering the lens. And that's when I heard it again, right behind me, the same wet, labored breath. I didn't look back. I ran out of the apartment in my pajamas, leaving everything behind, the camera, the laptop, and the life I was trying to rebuild. I stayed at a crowded hotel with bright lights, and the very next morning, I canceled my lease. The landlord didn't even seem surprised when I told him I was moving out. "That corner, right?" he said softly with a sigh. He told me I was the 4th tenant in a single year to leave so suddenly. He said the apartment had been part of a poorhouse in the 1920s, and a man with a severe skeletal deformity used to live there. That man was so terrified of other humans that he would hide in the shadows, training himself to breathe as silently as possible so no one would find him. He died in that room, and no one found his body for weeks because he was just that good at hiding. Now I'm in a new, bright apartment, no dark corners, no strange shadows. But I still sleep with the lights on, and I've never dared to check the footage from any camera again, because deep down, I know he didn't just want to watch me. He was waiting for me to see him, so he wouldn't have to hide in the shadows alone anymore. The forest behind my house in rural Pennsylvania was always my sanctuary, but after that Saturday evening, the silence of the trees doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels hungry. It was late September. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges. I was out in the yard trying to whistle for my dog, Lucky. Usually he comes charging at the first sound of his name, but that day he just stood there. He was frozen at the edge of the tree line, his hackles raised, emitting a low, vibrating growl I had never heard before. "Lucky, get over here, boy!" I shouted. Just as I stepped toward him, a voice drifted out from the thick shadows of the oaks. It was unmistakable. It was warm, familiar, and calm. It was my mother's voice. "Honey, is that you? Come here for a second. I need help carrying these groceries. They're so heavy." I stopped in my tracks. "Mom?" I called out. "I thought you were staying in town tonight." No answer, just the sound of dry leaves skittering across the dirt. Then the voice came again, slightly louder, coming from just behind a dense thicket of thorns. "Please, honey, my hands are full. Just step over here and help me. Be a sweetheart." My foot was literally inches from the dark, tall grass of the woods when the phone in my pocket vibrated so hard it made me jump. I pulled it out. The caller ID read, "Mom." My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. I swiped to answer. "Hi, sweetie," my mom's voice chirped through the tiny speaker. "I just pulled into the mall. I realized I forgot my phone charger at your place, so my battery is about to die. I'll see you in about an hour, okay?" The world went cold. I couldn't speak. I just stared into the pitch-black gaps between the trees. "Okay, drive safe, Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. The moment I hung up, the atmosphere changed. The woods went dead silent. Not a bird, not a cricket, nothing. Then the voice from the bushes spoke again, but it wasn't warm anymore. It sounded distorted, like a recording being played at the wrong speed. "Come here now. Mom is waiting. Come here." I didn't think. I grabbed Lucky by the collar. He was whimpering now, and I bolted. I ran into the house, slammed the heavy oak door, and threw every deadbolt I had. I sprinted through the house, closing the curtains and locking every window. I sat on the kitchen floor in the dark, clutching a steak knife, my heart drumming against my ribs. Then I heard it. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Long, sharp nails dragging slowly across the wooden siding of the house. It circled the perimeter, once, twice. It stopped right outside the kitchen window. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't break the glass. And then it laughed. It wasn't my mother's laugh. It was mine. It was the exact pitch, the exact cadence of my own laughter, mocking me from the darkness outside. I stayed on that floor until the sun came up. When my mom finally did get home, she found me sitting in the driveway, my car, with the doors locked, waiting for her. I never told her what happened. How do you tell someone that something in the woods tried to wear their voice like a mask? We moved out a month later, but sometimes when I'm in a quiet place, I still hear my own voice whispering to me from the shadows, telling me to come back. Do you ever really know who's calling you from the dark? If these stories gave you the chills, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these nightmares coming. I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these 3 encounters was the most unsettling for you? And have you ever had a gut feeling that ended up saving your life? Sleep tight if you can. I'll see you in the next one.